Hey everyone, welcome back to Wicked Deeds. We're your hosts. I'm Brittany.
And I'm John.
And today's episode is a listener choice documentary review covering Girl in the Picture, which can be watched right now on Netflix. We hit on some of the points of the story and give our opinion on how we feel the documentary was put together. So without further ado, today's episode is our review of Girl in the Picture.
Let's start with my expectations.
Yes, because I had already seen this. So
Right.
I was going into it with a whole different set of expectations than you were.
Yeah, so I remember vaguely you watching this and you were like, oh my God, this is ridiculous. Oh my God, it keeps getting worse. What? It keeps getting worse.
Yeah.
And it just was like a constant escalation of like disbelief on what happens and what's at least portrayed in this documentary.
It's like, how is this real life?
Right.
Is what it felt like when I was watching it the first time anyway.
Right. So for me, with this being the third documentary that we've watched for the podcast specifically, I think going into it, I had low expectations. I know that you were surprised by a lot of the content that was in there and hearing this story about this, tragic life this girl lived. So I had my seatbelt buckled. But I think the constant theme that, at least now in reflecting upon having watched this, I can affirm it. But going into it, I was kind of like, okay, I bet this story is crazy, but I bet it's not put together in the best way possible.
Which is pretty much what it seems like happens with these documentaries. They're either too
Exactly.
long, too short, they don't answer a lot of questions, or, it's just like random things are left out and you're wondering why, and you kind of feel like you have to do your own research after to really get the full story.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's definitely a common theme among these documentaries.
Yes, and I think that after watching this, so that was my initial thought. It was like, okay, I bet it's a crazy story, but I bet it's not put together that well. I think after watching it, that's affirmed my belief, and I'm thinking that, okay, is this going to be a common theme going forward for all of these documentaries? It sucks because it's like a very entrancing story. I think Killer Legends was a little bit different because it was kind of like, it was like a Ghost Hunters episode type thing.
Yeah, definitely different.
But with, the hatchet-wielding hitchhiker and now Girl in the Picture, they leave you wanting to know more.
Oh, absolutely.
And I don't think that's their intention.
Yeah, I feel like it doesn't seem that way.
That may be because we're working within the true crime genre and we're more inquisitive
And
than
we
your
try not
average
to
viewer.
leave things out. Yeah.
Right. I mean, we want to know more, and we know all of the ancillary things that go on in a case.
Yep.
And I understand that this is kind of more or less telling a story of a life and all the tragedies within it, but you can't help but watch it and want to know more about it and wonder, well, if you took all this time and effort to put it together, why did you leave these things out?
Yeah, those are definitely some of my questions by the end. So I think we're going to kind of structure this episode by giving you, as John just called it before we started recording, an elevator pitch of what the entire story is about and kind of how this unfolded and the structure to the documentary itself. It'll probably be a little bit longer than an elevator pitch because I feel like I'm long-winded, but
you can give a synopsis.
Yeah, and then
we'll go more in depth into, almost like a chapter book of this documentary. So here's your spoiler warning now.
Yes.
There will be plenty of spoilers in this. If you haven't watched it, maybe pause, go watch it, and come back. If you have watched it, let's see if we agree on our opinion on this.
Yeah, and I think after that, we'll kind of go through our thoughts on the story, what we thought about the actual case itself, questions we had on that, our thoughts on the documentary's presentation of the case, what we ended up rating it at the end of the day, and then some really big questions that we both ended up having by the end of this.
Now, I know when we watched The Hatchet-Wielding Hitchhiker, we had a general idea of what we graded it, and then upon further reflection, we changed our ratings.
Yes.
Now, I have a general idea of what I had rated it after we watched Girl in the Picture.
Mm-hmm.
Do we want to give our ratings now, and then as we talk about this, see if it affects our rating in a positive or negative light?
I think we should do that, and I think everybody listening should tell us if they like that to see if we end up changing what we think once we really talk it out.
Right, because I don't want any of our listeners to hear that we give something a low rating, because again, we are harsh critics when it comes to rating things, harsher than the average person at least.
I would say so.
I don't want you to hear, oh, this thing's, a 3 and be totally turned off from watching it. It's just, we're looking at it through the lens of not just, okay, what content was put out there, but also what content was missed and how was it put out there, and kind of thinking about how, Brittany usually structures a story when she's gathering information and then putting an episode together. So I don't want our reviews, if they're bad, to stop people from listening.
Or to stop people from watching the documentary itself.
Right, exactly. Obviously, if they're listening to this episode, they're going to listen regardless.
Yeah.
But I don't want that, like, if they're listening to this and they don't care about spoilers, I don't want them to not watch the documentary if they find it interesting.
I agree.
Because it is an interesting story and it is wild.
Well, I don't think that our rating has any bearing on the story. You can't rate someone's tragedy. Like, this is just a horrible, horrible thing that happened. Our rating is more designated for how this documentary was put together, the things we felt like were missed, the problems that we had with it. Nothing to do with this girl's story.
Right. The story is messed up. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a documentary.
Exactly. Yeah. So I do want to start out by saying that IMDb gives this a rating of 7.2 out of 10, which I think is pretty high for a documentary.
I think that's very generous.
I think people are rating this story more than they are the actual documentary's presentation. And like you said before, we're very inquisitive. People are not always going to go and dig for more, or by the end of a documentary, literally have a list of questions that we were wondering throughout the whole thing that they just completely glossed over that we felt like were really important. So I think people are probably giving this rating more so because this is such a compelling story and such a crazy story. And at every turn, there's just something more horrific that happens to this girl that it's like, how could you rate this documentary any lower? Because then you seem like a bad person. But like, that's not how we're rating this. So
you're
disclaimer out there,
Right. You're never rating the content that this documentary is based off of.
Correct.
You're rating the documentary and the presentation itself.
Yes, agreed.
And again, I think that a 7.2 is generous, but you do have a lot of, let's call them normal people watching this thing. I mean, it's on Netflix. If they put it up in front of you and you're just like, oh yeah, okay, I'll watch it, and you're not a true crime enthusiast that's going into this like looking for it, even if you split them 50-50 and the true crime enthusiasts are rating it, a 4 or a 5, and the people that are just watching it because it looks interesting are rating it an 8 or a 9, you're going to end up around a 7. So
yep, that's true.
Upon our initial watch, or your second watch,
this was my second watch,
I guess I would want to know first, upon a second viewing, did you think it was better or worse? And did you find that you caught on to more things the second time you watched it, or were you just more critical of it?
I think I definitely caught on to more things the second time I watched it, and I had more questions the second time I watched it. Obviously, when you're watching it in a setting where you know that you're going to be critiquing it, essentially, you're gonna be more...
Right, it's under the microscope.
Yeah, so I would say the first time I watched it, I don't remember off the top of my head, I watched it a while ago, but I would say I probably rated it around like a 6.5.
It was good enough that you were willing to put out the poll to social media and see if people wanted us to watch this or something else and then do a review on it.
Yes, speaking of, this was multiple of our followers on Instagram that chose for us to review this particular documentary. We gave several options, and this was the winner. So
like substantially ahead of everything else.
Yeah, substantially more. So I wonder if these are all people who have watched it already and want to know our thoughts, or people who might want to watch it and it's like in their saved for later or whatever you would call it on Netflix, your watch list.
Right. I bet that it's people that have watched it. And I think that they probably enjoyed it.
Yep.
And once they listen to this, it may be like, oh yeah, I didn't think about that. Yeah, why didn't they add that in? Or why did they keep this out? Or whatever. because, again, they're probably looking at it as something to watch, a story to learn about, and not looking at it through, the microscope and a critical lens, right, of, okay, well, what is this as a whole, as a production?
All right, so my rating now, after watching it a second time, I gave it a 5.5. Which I think is above average.
Yes.
Because we are definitely the type of people who see a 5 as average.
Right.
A 3-star out of 5 is average.
Yeah, I mean, even if you want to...
Even a 2.5?
Split hairs, a 2.5 is average.
Yeah.
But, yeah, I think a 5.5 is something that is totally watchable, even if you are critical of the finished product, not necessarily the source material. But as with most things, I'm a little harsher. And this was my initial view.
Yes.
I ended up giving it a 5 even. Which, we'll see if that changes by the end of it.
Yes.
But that's enough rambling about what we watched, why we watched it, how we rate things, blah, 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 blah. Let's get into the story itself, and we'll do a brief synopsis, and then we can kind of get on from the very beginning of the documentary itself.
Yeah. So I do want to start this off by saying one of the biggest things for me that was very difficult, and probably why I dropped my rating down, is because of how the story is told. Essentially, it's told backwards, except for a certain portion at the beginning. So you start out at this point, it seems as though the story is going to go backwards, but then all of a sudden you jump like 4 years ahead, and then you back up again, and then you move forward one more time, and then you back up again. So it was definitely one of those things where you can't have this documentary on in the background.
You need to have your full attention.
Exactly. You need to be paying attention, no phone, no doing dishes, cleaning your kitchen, having this on in the background, whatever. You have to sit there and you really have to pay attention, because even when we were watching it, I rewound multiple times to be like, wait, hold on, where are we? What's going on? Right,
because there are so many different characters, and with the time jumps from, where they begin the story to where they go, and then they go back to when she was a child and forward again, and then really far forward, and it's just the time jumps are, I guess, without direction, because they do go forward, backwards, sideways, up, down, left, right, and there are a lot of people that are interviewed in this documentary. Sometimes with a documentary, you may have, a couple experts, a couple people that are involved, and that's it. And then it's, footage from something, or somebody telling a story and going to a location to show, where something may have happened, or describing the times of when something like this did happen to, give you an idea or paint a picture for you.
Yep.
Whereas there are a lot of people that knew this young lady, and we should probably say her name by this point.
Well, so that's the thing.
You don't know it at the beginning.
You don't know her name at the beginning. So, and that's the other part that's really hard, is this girl ended up having multiple different names throughout her life. So I think we should just kind of start with giving a little bit of a synopsis of the story and kind of where it's going, and we'll touch on things as we work through it, giving our opinions, yada, 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 all that.
But it is good to plant the foundation that this is a very time-jumpy documentary, so make sure you pay attention and don't be distracted. Otherwise, even if you don't want to rewind, you're going to have to rewind, or else you're not going to know what's going on.
Yeah, you're going to be so lost.
You're going to be like, who is this person, and why are they even involved, and why are they calling this girl this name?
And then all of a sudden, you're going to be like, oh, wait, hold on, that's the same person. Now I really do need to rewind because I don't know anything that just happened.
Right. So to give just a brief elevator pitch synopsis, this documentary covers the multiple lives that were lived by one woman and her companion, I guess you would call it, because is it a father? Is it a boyfriend? Is it a relative at all? Is it a stranger? You don't really know.
Yeah, you're questioning the relationship between this girl and her quote-unquote husband, is how he's described at the beginning of the documentary. And you're like, okay, so who is this guy even? And you're working through her life backwards, really.
And not to give away the ending, because I don't think it does, this story is about the life of Suzanne Savakis.
Yes.
But she ain't going to be called that this entire episode.
Pretty much, yeah. We're going to finally find that out pretty much at the very end. So, like I said, the story is told backwards, but where it begins is in April of 1990 in Oklahoma City, when a woman was found in bad shape on the side of the road. And this was actually something that I had pointed out in my second time watching this, was that they said like, oh, she was deceased at the scene, except she was not. Someone mentioned that later on, and that's not how they start out the documentary. She was in bad shape, but she was not dead yet.
After she was struck by a vehicle.
Yes, so it appeared as though she was in a hit and run. So she ends up being brought to the hospital, and she's with a man. So the woman's name is Tanya Hughes, and the man that she's with is Clarence Hughes, and he was her husband. And he is just weird. He's significantly older than her. He's acting strange.
Doesn't want to let her out of his sight.
Yeah, it's just a very bizarre situation. And then there was this one point where a doctor later said of Tanya that she had a, quote, sinking spell and just died within the hospital.
Which is very weird to me because I even looked into it. I was like, what is a medical sinking spell?
Yeah.
And the only thing that really comes up is like syncope, which is like when you faint.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually you come to. There's no serious injury to you at this point. So I don't know what it was that they were referencing when they said initially she had a sinking spell and eventually passed away.
Yeah.
I was like, okay, well, I'm hearing sinking spell. I'm thinking sinking in quicksand. Did she come in? She was in bad shape and she just kept getting worse and worse and worse and eventually died.
Mm-hmm.
But when you look up sinking spell, that's not what it is. So
yeah, it seemed like this was like
happened.
this doctor's description, like the best way he could explain it. Like, you know, she was okay, and then all of a sudden she like immediately sunk down and passed away. Yeah. So it was just obviously this strange situation. They start to touch on the fact that like this didn't seem like a hit and run, that her injuries were not consistent with that. It was just a very weird situation. Again, the husband was being a creep, and it was just bizarre.
Yeah, and I think that they planted that seed early on, that this guy that was hanging around her was acting weird. And going forward, we'll learn more about Tanya Hughes and this man that was with her.
Yep.
And that's what kind of unfurls as we go. And the only way that you can really understand it is by saying, okay, yeah, it was Tanya Hughes. Oh, but no, then it was this person, this person. So,
yep.
So after this, Tanya Hughes was in a quote unquote alleged hit and run, dies. And then we start meeting
More
other
people.
Characters.
Yes. So you then are introduced to a woman named Karen Parsley. And she had at one point worked with Tanya, I believe, at like a dance strip club type
Yeah, I
place.
think it was like called Passions or something.
Yeah.
At least in her IMDb profile.
That's what it's called.
Under here, it's she's labeled as a dancer at Passions.
Yes. So after you meet this woman, she is like explaining what happened because obviously she's distraught that one of her best friends has now died, and she wasn't getting anywhere with Clarence, the weird husband. So she ends up calling family of Tanya Hughes, I guess from the phone book, because it was 1990. So, you know, you can't just like go find someone on Facebook. And come to find out, Tanya Hughes died 20 years prior as a toddler. So they're like, wait, hold on, who is this woman?
Right.
And that's like how the whole story is framed for you in the beginning.
That's the initial hook. It's like you have Tanya Hughes, you have Clarence. Tanya Hughes dies in an alleged hit and run. And then you meet this person, Karen. And Karen is trying to do follow-up work to let family members know that Tanya has passed away. And then we find out that Tanya Hughes is not who they said they were.
Exactly. So you're like, okay, this story's about to get wild, I can tell. So it definitely does drag you right in, and you're very intrigued by the story. So then you start to learn more, and you find out that she's married to this Clarence guy. He's significantly older than her. And also come to find out they had a 2-year-old son named Michael. And then it kind of like jumps all over the place, but just to like get to the meat and potatoes of the story, essentially, we find out that Clarence Hughes is not who he said he is, and he was not the biological father of Michael. So, because Tanya had passed, Clarence is not the father. He's got no parents. He ends up in the foster care system, and he ends up with a loving family of Ernest and Merle. Bean is their name.
And I love their backdrop.
Yes, they had the best backdrop in the whole documentary.
They're both sitting in their own personal recliners, and they got their house like behind them. And these people seem like good foster parents.
Absolutely. So they ended up having Michael for 4 years. Of course, Clarence was like trying to get him back, this whole thing. But he ended up in a really, really good, loving home. Michael did have some issues. They definitely could tell from the beginning. It seemed as though he struggled, didn't have a good home life. But he ended up, coming around. And overall, the Beans and Michael had just a wonderful relationship, and they wanted to adopt him.
Mm-hmm. And it seemed like he was getting better, too.
Absolutely, yeah. Being in a healthy family home environment compared to what you end up finding out he was exposed to later. Right. So then you fast forward now to September of 1994, and you, as the watcher, are now discovering that Clarence Hughes ended up kidnapping Michael from his school in September of 94. He held the school's principal at gunpoint. He went in, he found Michael in a classroom, took them both out of the school, brought the principal to some remote area and taped him to a tree, and then just kidnapped Michael and was just out of there.
What blew my mind is it seems like Clarence took this principal to a remote location and tied him or taped him to the tree, but then somebody happens upon this principal and
finds him. Yeah.
Because he would have died.
Yes, he absolutely would have. So that was such a blessing, but wild at the same time. So now is when they're starting to dig into Clarence Hughes within the documentary, and they're explaining to you.
Because we have a kidnapped child now.
Yes. So the story then begins to focus on him and this part of the story. And you find out that he, guess what, is not who he says he is. And his name was actually Franklin Delano Floyd. And he was a man who had a messed up history. He had previously kidnapped and raped a young girl, spent time in prison, had kidnapped and sexually assaulted multiple other women. He was just a bad freaking guy.
A sordid past, to say the least.
Yes, that's exactly what I have written here in my notes. Thank you very much. But I felt like they kind of abruptly went from that into the next thing. So it's
it's a sharp transition.
Yeah, so they sprinkle it on for you to say, this Floyd guy is messed up.
And now he's in possession of this child.
And he was also involved with Tanya, and that's a weird situation. So you're your mind's spinning and you're like, wait, hold on. Who is this guy? What's going on? Boom, they're on to the next thing. And now you're talking about who Tanya was prior to being in Oklahoma City. And you're like, okay, so come to find out she was actually a girl named Sharon Marshall. And you're like, okay.
So wait, isn't she Tanya?
Exactly. So she's not Tanya.
Sharon.
We know she's not. That name was taken from a deceased toddler. So now you're like, all right, so we're going back in the story. Before she was Tanya, she was now Sharon. So if you're already getting confused as you're listening, welcome to our life, because this is exactly what we were feeling like as we were watching this. And they had lived down, I think it was in the South, if I'm correct. It seemed like Georgia, Florida, around this time frame. There were multiple states that they were in over multiple spans of time.
Right.
Very hard to nail down exactly where they were at certain times, other than the beginning and the end, really, of the documentary. It was very sporadic because you're just jumping around so much.
Right. And even when you're flashing back to a different character, when you go to Merle Bean and Ernest Bean, and you're like, okay, where were these people?
Yeah. Yep.
I don't remember what state these people were in.
Yes.
But they're the ones that were taking care of Michael. And that's when Clarence Hughes or Franklin Delano Floyd abducted the kid.
Yep.
And it's like, okay, but where was this? And I think that is part of the reason where the rating drops.
Yeah, because it's just so hard to follow.
Right. I think the epitome of something great from a documentary standpoint, a movie standpoint, a television standpoint, is you should not have to rack your brain to understand the plot.
Yes, completely agree.
Now, there can be Easter eggs put into something, or as you reflect on something, you may find a deeper meaning.
Or foreshadowing, things like that.
That's totally fine. But when you're, given a path and you're telling a story about something, and then it abruptly stops and goes to a totally different group of characters.
Yes.
And then they start telling that story, and then that stops.
Then you go back to the story from before.
Else. It's like, what the hell am I supposed to know right now? I don't remember these people or where they were. I remember the people, but I don't remember where they lived. And so many different locations and so many different names for the same person. So I think that's really where I took a couple notches off the rating there.
Yeah, it was definitely very abrupt. It's like you're going down a 2-lane highway, and then the exit is on your right, but the exit is a literal 90-degree turn. You are just
You're
off,
going too fast.
You are you are completely confused now. So that's how I felt watching it the first time. I specifically remember that.
But when you know the turn is coming,
yes,
it's easier to go with the transition. So the second time viewing may be better.
But I was still slightly lost, even though I had already seen this. Don't get me wrong, I had seen it like 4 or 5 months prior, but I was still definitely lost.
Yeah.
So at this point now, we're talking about still staying with Tanya Hughes and Clarence Hughes, but now we know who Clarence is. He's really Floyd. So moving forward, we're going to refer to him as his real name. This is who he was, his name.
Franklin Delano Floyd.
Correct. But I'll probably just call him Floyd because that's his last name. Makes it easier. And then Tanya is now Sharon Marshall. This is before she was Tanya, though. So try and keep up. It's definitely confusing.
Which, just to throw another wrench in, and I don't want to confuse people even more, but we're calling Floyd by his true name.
Correct.
But at the time, Tanya Hughes was then known as Sharon Marshall.
Yes.
Floyd was known as Warren Marshall.
Correct. Yes.
So now we've got a documentary telling us a story where somebody that we've known as Clarence Hughes, Franklin Delano Floyd, Warren Marshall.
Correct.
So if you're not paying attention, you have 3 different names that are all the same person.
Well, there are actually more names too, because at one point...
But I'm saying at this point.
But at one point they panned off and they were like, Floyd also has had this, and this for aliases.
Did, yes.
So you have like 17 names and you're like, all right, I don't know who the heck is who. So hopefully I can continue to follow this story. That was like probably one of our biggest gripes with the documentary itself.
Being able to track.
Just how confusing and how difficult it was to really follow where you are and who is who. Right.
Not only are you jumping timelines, but you're jumping names for one person. So you're changing that person's name, and you're changing the timeline, and you're changing the location.
Correct.
So it's like, what the hell am I watching?
Definitely the biggest gripe. So at this point now, you're kind of, again, going backwards now. So you had gone forward, and now we're going back, and we're going to kind of continue to go backwards, except there'll be a couple little random turns throughout. So Sharon Marshall was in high school at this point. Warren Marshall
was her perceived father.
Correct. And she was brilliant. Like, they had interviews with multiple people that knew her back then, but specifically one was Jenny Fisher, who was a friend of hers back when they were in high school. And she was talking a lot about Sharon and just how she was so smart and how she excelled in school. And she had these insane aspirations, which I was just like so impressed by a girl in like the 80s wanting to be a freaking aerospace engineer.
Right.
Like,
now people want to be TikTok stars.
Right. She gets into freaking Georgia Tech on a full scholarship. Like, this girl was so freaking brilliant.
And to compound, knowing what we know.
Yeah.
This girl was on the path to greatness.
Yes.
With a really messed up life.
Absolutely.
So imagine if she was, cultured in a good family life, what she could have been capable of.
Oh my God, everything.
Right.
So now you start to learn about her father, who is, as I'm going to continue to call him, Franklin Floyd.
But going by Warren Marshall at the time. Correct.
Sorry for the confusion. I'm confused telling you the story. So he was incredibly controlling. He was really creepy. This was like the whole thing, that is like the whole vibe.
Forgive me if I'm wrong, but as Suzanne Savakis, the real name of this female, and Franklin Delano Floyd, the real name of this male, are going as the Marshalls, I think they were living in a trailer park because then another really messed up situation happens with Jenny.
Yes, but I do want to touch on one thing before we talk about that. So regarding how this guy is creepy, this thing that I'm about to tell you is brought up before the whole situation with the dad later. Yeah. So Floyd, going as Marshall at the time, was just doing very creepy things. It's like the whole vibe of him throughout this entire documentary.
An odd guy.
Yeah. And there was just this one thing that stood out to me and obviously John, like, as we are watching this. And it was just like, who does and or says this? It just struck us as so odd. And I don't know of any normal person genuinely that would ever act this way. Like, I cannot understand it. And at this point, I think it was Jenny's father.
Yes.
That Floyd asked, Like,
met for the first time.
Yeah, met for the very first time. It was like he was either like bringing Sharon over to spend time with her or something, like chatting with her dad, and just all of a sudden out of the blue was like, hey man, can you give me a loan?
You got a really nice house. Hey, can I have some money?
Like, what on earth? Who in their right mind is just going to walk up to someone that they've never met and just say, hey, I need like $50K?
Right. It's just a red flag. And especially with it being the first time that these guys have ever met each other, it's like, oh, I'm introducing myself. You know, our daughters are friends. I'm bringing her over the house and my name's such and such. And yeah, can I have some money?
Right? Like,
who does that?
I was just thinking about like when we have children and if like their parents came over and we met them for the first time and they were like, hey, I need like $10,000.
Like,
it would be...
There's the door. Get
right?
out.
It would be a different story if they were like, oh my God, I left my bag at home. I need to grab the kids something. Like, do you have $5? I'll pay you back. I'd be like,
Right.
sure, whatever.
I was supposed to grab pizza on the way home.
Right. He's out here asking for a whole ass loan.
Right.
Like, this is the most bizarre thing I've ever heard in my life.
Yep.
So, you know, we're already like, we knew he was weird. Then we find out about his past and we're like, wow, he's really weird. And then we find out like, yeah, he's a horrible dude and he's ballsy and he's like just ridiculous, this guy. He is ridiculous. And if you're looking at this through the lens of not knowing about his past, which I kind of almost wish that they had done because these things probably would have stood out even more as like you said before, Easter eggs or maybe foreshadowing to show who he was and how he was. I almost feel like we found out about his past too soon.
Yeah.
Because then you're just so lost on everything.
And
with
you're already
Suzanne.
looking at him as a bad person.
Exactly.
So then when he's asking for this loan, it's not, oh, can I have this loan, you know, to help my daughter?
Yeah.
It's no, can I have this loan because I'm a piece of dirt?
Exactly. Yeah. So that's just a whole other opinion on.
Because
on
he probably
mine,
could have taken the $50K, changed his name, and then been in the wind.
Clearly real good at doing that.
Right.
So, but all right, moving on. So now at this point, you find out a couple things. One thing you find out is that when Sharon Marshall, a.k.a. Tanya Hughes, a.k.a. Suzanne Savakis, her real name, was young, apparently her quote-unquote mother, but spoiler alert, not her actual mother, had been hit by a car on a bridge when she was young, which is like backwards shadowing, I guess.
Yeah.
Like for what ended up happening to her when she was Tanya and how the whole documentary began.
Right.
So then you're starting to ask questions like, okay, is this like a common theme for this man? Like, obviously, we know he had a bad past. Did he do the same thing to her mother? Because at this point, you don't know. Yeah, it's just...
It's like, what are the odds that, you know, you have multiple women in your life and they both die in a similar manner?
Exactly. And it is suspicious. It's something to look at.
Right.
So after that, though, you find out the bombshell that Sharon Marshall is pregnant. 17, 18 years old. She's super young. And she felt like her life was just kind of falling apart now. She had this full ride to Georgia Tech, all this other stuff. And she ended up having to have the baby, I think. I think he like wanted her to keep it. I don't know what was happening there exactly.
I don't know. There's a bunch of convoluted stuff that you don't learn in the documentary that we kind of learned about after the fact, where there may have been multiple pregnancies, people that weren't included in the documentary that do exist. And we were wondering, okay, well, we don't believe that Floyd is Suzanne Savakis' real father. And we learned some things that you're going to touch on shortly. It's like, okay, she's pregnant. Is she pregnant from a boyfriend? Or is this weird, you know, relationship with her quote unquote father going on? Like, it's weird. Your brain's, the gears are turning.
Yeah. And you're like, okay, so how did she end up pregnant? What's going on here?
And then you find out.
And then you find out that there is this beyond disturbing thing that happened between, so we're going to call them as they are now. So Warren Marshall, Sharon Marshall, and then her friend Jenny. And Sharon and Jenny were hanging out at her house / trailer. I'm not exactly sure, but they were, you know, just being teenage girls, whatever. They're like trying on cute clothes. They're like in bras, whatever, just like hanging out together. And at one point, Floyd, aka Warren Marshall, walks in and like essentially like attacks the girls and makes Jenny clearly super uncomfortable. Like she's half naked here and this is her friend's dad. This is not how things are supposed to be. And then he comes in with a freaking gun in his hand and he's like waving it around. There are no doors in this house. Also, they're just like curtains. And he ends up making, I think he made Jenny like lay on the ground, like with her head in a pillow or something. And he raped Sharon at gunpoint with her friend right there.
So at this
and
point,
we're just like, holy shit, like this is horrifying. This is like the worst thing I've ever heard in my life.
right. So we thought that Floyd was bad to begin with. So
Yeah.
first at the beginning of the story, he starts off and he's weird and he's hanging around,
Yeah.
going by a different name. Then we find out all the bad stuff that he's done.
Mm-hmm.
Then he abducts Michael. Then we find out that even years before Michael was alive, he raped his quote-unquote daughter, which was not really his daughter, at gunpoint with her friend
Yeah.
in the room at the time.
Yep.
And then you're thinking, okay, has he had children with this girl? Like, what's going on? And
So then
we
that
end
makes
up-
you go right back to your thought before of who is the father of this baby.
Right, exactly. So if he's raping Sharon at gunpoint in front of a friend, is he the one that impregnated her to begin with?
Exactly, yeah. And it's just so heartbreaking because I guess Sharon had gone to Jenny's house and said something to her about it. And she was like, please don't say anything. This is just how daddy is.
Right.
And that is just like, oh my God, this poor girl has obviously been dealing with this for her entire existence.
Right, she's been brainwashed.
It's not even, I mean, it's obviously brainwashing, but it's just like, it's abuse. Like at the end of the day, it's horrible.
Right, it's
Abuse.
Stockholm Syndrome.
Yeah, that's a better way to describe it. So now at this point, they actually end up going back to Franklin Floyd and discussing some of the situation with his past again. You find out that he had been in prison through the late 60s to about 1972. You find out that he had abducted and raped a young girl. You're finding out even more about that. And then at this point, they're talking about how they want to locate Floyd because we know that he had kidnapped Michael. He had been on the run. No one knew where he was. They needed to locate him. And they actually went back to what we were talking about a little bit earlier, how he had like multiple aliases. And they were like, well, if he's going to leave the state, he's probably going to use one of these aliases. And I betcha if he does, he's going to need to renew one of the licenses that he had. Lo and behold, he ended up doing that, found him in Kentucky under one of those previous aliases, and they arrested him and were charging him for the kidnapping of Michael. Mind you, Michael is nowhere to be found at this point. Nobody knows where this boy is. Floyd's not saying anything, so he's still missing, but I think most people at that point were assuming that he was deceased at the hands of Floyd.
Right.
So he goes to trial, and the prosecutors, I think it was, that was interviewed for the documentary, they said that this was like a highly circumstantial case, but you literally have this man.
You have the principal
Yeah.
who can literally say, firsthand account, I was abducted along with this child, and I was taped to a tree, and then this man left with the child.
Yes. Either way, regardless of whether it's circumstantial or not, jury didn't believe that, this was a tough case to convict on. So Floyd did end up getting convicted for the kidnapping of Michael and was sentenced to 52 years in prison. Then from here, you end up going back again, and then you're starting to find out about life when Sharon was in Florida. And this is where I started to get even more confused with the timeline. And she was working as a dancer. She was trying to perform sexual acts on men at this
Strip club
that she was working at. And then you're finding out that like he's kind of forcing her into doing these things. And again, it's just like, I can't quite tell.
Right, because these sexual acts were not something that happened normally at the club that she worked at.
Yeah.
So when people that worked there or the managers or whatever found out that she was doing this, that was bad.
Yes.
And then you find out that it was at the behest of Floyd, essentially forcing her to do that to make extra money.
Yes. So, and this is why I was getting confused too, because it's like, was she Tanya at this point? Was she Sharon at this point?
Right.
It was...
All we know is it was Suzanne at this point.
Yeah, it really was.
And
it was. So at one point in her life, he is forcing her to perform sex acts on men to bring money in for him,
right?
Essentially. So, you're finding out all this stuff about this strip club that she worked at, all of that. And, there was just so much that was going on there as well. But I will say the biggest point that comes out of that is a girl that Sharon was friends with at this strip club, and her name was Cheryl Comesso, and she becomes a part of this story because Floyd ends up becoming essentially obsessed with this girl, and she, was friends with Sharon, and then there was some weird like behind the scenes stuff going on there, and then you also find out that Cheryl goes missing, and you're like, what? Like,
Right.
what just happened there? Okay, this is confusing. And then...
And you're also thinking, okay, this guy Floyd is a total piece of dirt.
Exactly.
So this girl goes missing. He was just obsessed with her. Okay, is he tied to this?
Yes. So then you find out you're jolted again, and you're brought back more towards like present day of where you were like in 1994 when Michael was kidnapped. And you find out that authorities somehow, some way found the principal's car, because when Floyd had abducted Michael, he had taken the principal out of the school at gunpoint. They drove the principal's truck, I believe it was, and they track that down and find inappropriate pictures taped under the car.
Which is so weird.
And you're like, how in the hell did we get here?
Right. And the inappropriate pictures were of
Cheryl and Suzanne when she was young, as she was older, in very inappropriate sexual situations. And it looked as though that one of the women in these pictures had been beaten. She had been undressed, she was beaten, and it looked like she was potentially even deceased in these photos. So you're like, okay, what is going on?
And how did these pictures end up under a principal's truck?
Like, and why would you tape them there? And then why would you leave them? Like, the whole story just didn't make sense to me.
Right.
Why? Like, what happened with the truck? How did we land on the truck? What's going on with the
And
truck
why
and the
would
pictures?
Floyd have put these pictures underneath the truck?
Yeah.
It's not even his truck.
Yeah, it was just a weird situation. It seemed as though, you know, it was a cross-agency thing. They had talked about it. But again, it's just like, it kind of just threw you right into this random new thing. And you're like, okay, we're on to a new topic now. And then you come to find out that there was actually a Jane Doe that had been found. And for several years, she did not have her name. Then you fast forward again and you find out that Franklin Floyd actually killed Cheryl Comesso, who was friends with Sharon Marshall, a.k.a. Suzanne Savakis, when she worked at this strip club in Florida. It's a lot.
Right.
I'm like, so, like, wow.
Even
You
trying
know,
to tell
as
it,
we're
knowing the
explaining it.
documentary, it's like...
Yeah, this is a very, very difficult story to tell without,
You would have to...
like, years of prep.
Right. What you would have to do is you would have to take the timeline from the very beginning, and you would have to refer to these people as their real names. And you would have to say, okay, when such and such was this age, so-and-so kidnapped her, and they traveled the world under these assumed aliases, and
Yeah.
blah, 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 blah. And that's how
Mhm.
you would have to do it. But that's not the way the documentary does it. And if you're reviewing the documentary, you have to review the way that they
Told the story.
told the story. And I think that's the
Yeah.
biggest problem
Mhm.
is maybe they wanted to tell it one way and then somebody else wanted to do it a different way, or they couldn't really figure out how they wanted to do it. So they wanted to, you know, build hooks in every now and then to be like,
Yeah.
oh, well, you thought this was real. Psych, this is what's happening.
Yeah.
Psych, that's not true. This is what's happening. And everything we told you was not true because these people are really Floyd and Suzanne Savakis. It's like,
Yeah.
it's almost like the rug pull happens every 20 minutes.
It's true, yeah. And I'm just now remembering and realizing. So what I said a few minutes ago about being unsure of who she was at this point. She was Sharon when she worked at this strip club with Cheryl. And the whole reason for her even becoming Tanya Hughes is because Franklin Floyd had murdered Cheryl Comesso and they needed to get the hell out of Dodge.
Yes.
So he decided in that instance that they were going to change their names because they knew that people were supposedly on the lookout for them, because he had apparently been very vocal and potentially even hit her and yelled at her in a parking lot. So like all eyes were on him because everyone knew who he was, because he was a super creep, because he was making Sharon perform these sex acts and do these other things
I
that
feel
she
like
didn't
he was
wanna
trying to
do.
become Cheryl's pimp.
That's kind of what it seemed like, yeah. And then, so Floyd decides at this point, he's like, nope, we're going to get the hell out of here. And instead of what police are going to be looking for, which was a father, his daughter, and her child, no, we're going to flip the script. And Floyd's now going to be the husband. Sharon is going to be the wife. And then Michael is their shared child. Cops aren't looking for people that are married. They're looking
Right.
for a father-daughter duo. So he, again, is just going about this whole new life. This seems like something he's gotten really good at. He can leave the state. He can change his name and just completely start over. And that's what he did when they became Tanya and Clarence Hughes. So again, I feel like this feels very all over the place. It was very hard to follow at this point, you know, and I just feel as though Cheryl and her story did not get enough time. I felt like it was very kind of glossed over. You didn't really get the full gist of everything that was going on. I understand the documentary was not about Cheryl's story, but I still feel as though her story should have been told a bit better so that you could really grasp what happened there. Because if this man is responsible for her murder, this story does still also kind of revolve around him in a way. He is. He absolutely is.
Yeah.
So, all right, back to the story. We had kind of just talked about, the whole thing with Cheryl, how we felt like that wasn't very fleshed out, and then kind of where Suzanne had hit a stop sign with Floyd kind of stopping her whole future, really, for his own good.
Right.
So at this point, you're now thrown in back a little bit into Cheryl's story, and you find out that Floyd is actually being charged for it. Mind you, he's been in jail this entire time for kidnapping Michael. Now he's going to be going on trial for the murder of Cheryl Comesso, and he was being charged with first-degree murder, and he faced the death penalty in that case. After the trial, again, very glossed over, very quickly discussed, he ends up convicted and was sentenced to death. So the story goes on, and you find out even more about Sharon/Tanya/Suzanne's past. And this is the point where you're starting to realize that obviously she's none of these identities. She is somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
And they wanted to find out who she was. So now you bring in more characters into the story that are being interviewed for this documentary. And you've got these 2 agents from the FBI that came in to speak with Floyd because they wanted to know 2 things. First and foremost, they wanted to find Michael's body. They wanted to know where he was, and they wanted to know what happened to him, because still at this point, nobody knows what's happened to him. And then the second thing is obviously they want to know who Sharon Marshall/Tanya Hughes is. So they actually end up getting him to confess about what happened to Michael. And he says that he shot Michael in the back of the head twice and hid his body in this remote location.
Wasn't that the same way that Cheryl was killed? 2 shots to the back of the head?
Potentially.
I think I remember commenting on that.
Yeah.
So it's a similar MO to how he had already killed Cheryl.
Yep.
Now we find out that he's confessing to Michael's murder.
Yep.
And same way he killed Cheryl, he killed Michael.
Exactly. So these FBI agents end up getting this supposed location from Floyd to try and find Michael's body. They go to this area. They search for days on end. They did their absolute best and unfortunately just never were able to recover Michael's remains. So then you would probably be thinking like, okay, so what happened with Sharon/Tanya? Do we know who she is? Mm-hmm. No, they flip you into something new before they reveal that detail to you. So now they're interviewing an author, and they're talking about this guy and how he got really invested in this case and really wanted to find out who Sharon was and, just go through this whole thing with him and how he wrote a book and how he was very, frustrated that by the end of the book and by the time it was published, he couldn't figure out her identity, this whole thing. And there ends up being like this whole section with a girl that reaches out to him that believes she is Sharon's daughter. Mm-hmm. So now you're like, hold on, she had more kids?
Right, she had Michael, but who is this other person that's saying that they're her child?
Exactly, and she, I believe, would have been older than Michael when she was born. Mm-hmm. So was she actually the pregnancy from when she got pregnant, when she was going to go to Georgia Tech?
Right, which we'll get into this after the fact, but this is what's going through your head at the time. It's like, okay, we knew about Michael. We knew that she was pregnant at least one time. But now where is this new child coming from?
Yes.
Like, they never even talked about this.
Yep. So she, I believe, had reached out to this author, and then they ended up doing a DNA test. They confirmed that she was, in fact, her daughter. And it was just this whole wild ride with another child. Then you fast forward and get back to the FBI agents again and how they were able to talk to Floyd. And this is finally where you're starting to get to who this woman is. Who was she? Where did she come from? What is her story? Where did it all begin? And Floyd pretty much just like spewed this whole story out to these agents and like told them everything and was like, oh yeah, her name's Suzanne Savakis. I essentially kidnapped her from my wife back in the mid-70s.
Yeah.
And you're like, what? Hold on. So then you end up finding out a lot more about Suzanne's family and kind of how her life began. And, she had 2 really loving parents, it seemed like. She had her mother, Sandra, father, Clifford Savakis. And I guess, they had gotten married, they had multiple children, and then Clifford went off to war, And when he came back, Sandra was like, well, I met someone new, and kind of just like up and left Suzanne and her siblings' father.
Mm-hmm.
So you're like, okay. And then Suzanne's mother's life kind of goes off the deep end. And I guess she was struggling for money. She had a little bit of a messed up past. And then she met Franklin Floyd, who was going by a different name at the time. Yet again, another alias. He was, this quote unquote knight in shining armor that was coming to save her and the kids. And they ended up getting together and getting married. And he, had all 3 girls, and, they were going to be this wonderful little family. And then Sandra, the mother, ended up writing a bad check and wound up in jail for 30 days. And during that time, Franklin Floyd kidnapped all 3 girls, brought 2 of them to, whether it be like an orphanage or foster care, whatever it was, and he took Suzanne and left. So that's where Suzanne/Sharon/Tanya's story began, when Franklin Floyd kidnapped her from her own mother, when he was supposed to be this, stepfather coming in to help, and just took her away from her life and literally did all of these horrible, horrible things.
But her mother's still alive.
Yeah, so her mother was still alive. The mom and dad were both interviewed for the documentary. A lot of people are not happy with her mother and the way that things went down with her.
Yeah, I mean, she seems very dismissive. She doesn't seem super invested in, especially back then, she didn't seem super invested in finding her daughter.
Yeah.
She stated that she went to the police and, it just didn't go anywhere, and it would appear as though she just didn't follow up and she didn't push like I know a lot of family members do in most of the cases that we cover. It's like that is their sole mission, is to find their missing loved one. And it just seemed like, maybe she couldn't be bothered because she had these other children and she had, another man in her life and blah, blah, blah. And then you find out that her dad was in Vietnam, and he seems like he's got some demons. He seems like a nice guy, and he seems, willing to have a relationship with Suzanne's daughter, which we find out later.
Yep.
But I understand people's frustration and distaste for Suzanne's mother. Because if your child goes missing, you always say, or you always hear, a mother will go to the ends of the earth for their child. And this mother clearly did not do that.
Yeah, so that definitely set people off. And then there was one woman that had been interviewed that had worked at the strip club in Florida. And she had mentioned that I guess something had happened to her when she was a child and she was taken. And her mother literally went to the ends of the earth to get her back.
Right.
So there are these other people within Suzanne's life who have had similar things happen to them and
didn't have the same fate.
Exactly, because their loved one pushed to bring them home.
Yeah.
So I think that was a good thing to kind of bring in there and to say there are really messed up things that happen in this world, and you need a support system to help you and to do whatever you can to bring you back or get you back.
Right. And what I found kind of interesting is the person that you find out that was also abducted was not a super likable character,
No.
I would say, throughout the documentary. And I know that a lot of times with documentaries, edits and cuts and all that jazz, all the backroom work on a motion picture play into how somebody is perceived.
Yes.
And this person wasn't perceived that well, I guess, or in a positive light.
Yeah.
Like she had her part to play in the story and telling what she knew. But then when you find out that this similar thing happened to her, you kind of sympathize with her more. And then you're like, maybe this is why she's this hardened person that maybe, really worried about herself and did care about the other people that were working around her, but also cut her losses when need be because, at the end of the day, she's number one to herself.
Yeah.
So I thought that was kind of interesting near the end of the documentary.
Yeah, I agree. So the documentary essentially ends with, Megan having a relationship with Suzanne's biological father, Clifford, and she had her own child on the way at the time. And, it's finally giving Suzanne her name back. They fixed her headstone and all of that. So, I thought the end was very moving, that she finally got her name back, that we knew who she was, that we knew her story. And, you know, that there was some good that came out of it with Megan having this relationship with Clifford and, you know, her really fighting for her mother, who she never even knew. And, you know, at least there was a little bit of justice with Floyd going to prison for at least Cheryl and Michael's deaths.
And the FBI agents uncovering who Sharon and Tanya and all these other names actually were.
Yes.
And we did have, we didn't really talk about it much, but there was one FBI agent that I feel like was the, you know, spotlight FBI agent throughout the whole time. And that was Joe Fitzpatrick, because he seemed to be like tracking Floyd throughout the years.
Yeah, the whole story.
Really, he wanted closure and he had retired. And then these two other FBI agents come in and they end up interviewing Floyd while he's in prison and after he's been sentenced to death. And, you know, once these guys figure it out, Joe Fitzpatrick finally has closure. And it's like, okay, now I know who this girl was.
Yeah.
So that was kind of nice too. But
yeah, I agree.
it's bittersweet because you know all of the tragedy that ensued throughout Suzanne's life. So
yeah, absolutely. So, thoughts on the story in general. I think if you guys couldn't tell by, honestly, I feel like how long this is so far, and like even just trying to express the story itself, we could have probably sat here for the next 4 hours and given you a play-by-play of this documentary. But you have to think there's all this information packed into like an hour and 46 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like, you know, first and foremost, this is a heartbreaking and tragic story.
I agree.
What happened to Suzanne is not right. Franklin Floyd is a piece of shit.
Mm-hmm.
And none of this ever should have happened. So again, I want to go back to what we said at the beginning. Our ratings have no bearing on her story.
Right. I mean, if you're talking about what happened to this woman throughout her entire life, essentially, from when she was very young to the point of when Floyd abducted her,
Mm-hmm.
and what happened to all of her relatives, essentially, you know, you have her foster parents, you have her children, you have her actual parents. It's a multi-level tragedy.
Yeah.
In that respect. It spans, you know, generations. But the documentary itself, I think it was too all over the place. Even when we're sitting here trying to recollect on what happened, we'll be talking about something and being like, oh, wait, but this happened. Oh, but this happened. And, you know, Joe Fitzpatrick, the FBI agent, who's, you know, an older man now, he plays a big part in the documentary. And I feel like we didn't even remember him until we started talking about the other two FBI agents that interviewed Floyd.
Well, and that's what I mean about, like, there are just so
they jump
many
around
details.
way too many times.
And I feel like you miss a lot because you're being bounced around all over the place. And
because while they're introducing new information, your brain is still trying to comprehend what they just told you. So it's really difficult to say, okay, this just happened. I'm still trying to, you know, work through that.
Mm-hmm.
Here's 3 new people in a new timeline doing something totally different than what we were just talking about.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this is a story where you probably could have done a 3 or 4 part series.
Yeah.
Oftentimes, documentaries or documentary series are either too long or too short.
Yes.
This one, in my opinion, was too short. I think that the jumping around was just kind of way too sporadic for me to really appreciate the story without further reflection afterwards.
Agreed.
And I think it would have been much better even if it was 3 parts or 4 parts.
I agree. So I compared this when we were watching this to another documentary that I've watched that John has not, but I'm curious if any of our listeners have seen it, The Innocent Man. And that was like a 6-part series. That's a wild ride. That's a crazy...
I mean, just look at The Staircase.
Well, yeah, so...
I've only watched that, you know, intermittently as you had been watching it, but what is it, 8 or 10 episodes?
Yeah, but that, like... I think that one's kind of different. That was like
you have a trial and stuff like that.
Very niche thing that they were doing back then. Like, I mean, they were literally following this guy around as he's going through trial for murder of his wife. You know, it was definitely a different type of experience.
I understand that, but in this case, you have a young girl that was kidnapped that lives essentially at least 2 different lives that we know about on top of her real life. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that warrants more than an hour and 46 minutes.
Oh, I completely agree. So all I'm trying to say is that I think that The Innocent Man should have been half as long as it was, because there was a lot of reiterating and a lot of going over the same things over and over again. Whereas
this is too
with
short.
this is too short, and I would have preferred for this to be double as long. So it's like, I feel like there are so many instances where we're watching, whether it be a series or whether it be a documentary, but based on true events, that they're either dragging it out for no reason or they're condensing it into this really small thing, and I just don't know why. Because as I'm sitting here and I'm looking at the IMDb cast list here, mind you, there are 2 people that I'm noticing are missing, which are Suzanne's real parents. But on this list, there are 18 people who were interviewed for this documentary. 18 people.
In an hour and 46 minutes.
Well, then you add the 2 that you're missing. So
they don't even get
20
10 minutes
people.
apiece.
Exactly. And then on top of that, to tell this story as well in that span of time, make it cohesive. I mean, this should have been at least a 3-part series with an hour-long episode each, minimum.
I mean, you could do it 4 parts, right? You
Yeah.
could do the initial portion where we believe her name is Tanya and whatever. That could be the initial intro. Then you can go to the portion about Sharon.
Yes.
Then you could go back to Tanya, and then you could wrap it up at the end where everything gets solved.
Yes,
It's
I agree.
I think it should have been a miniseries of 4 parts.
I completely agree. And I feel like her story deserves that, because this is just...
Right. And all of the people that are involved in it, too, because
Absolutely.
you need to give Cheryl time. You need to be able to build the relationship that Floyd had built with Cheryl. That way, when we find out that he murdered her, it's like, holy shit.
Yeah. It was just so bizarre to
It
just
was
like,
just
you're
glossed
throwing that
over
in and
and-
you're like, but how is this all flowing together? I feel like there could have been a lot more done with making everything just less confusing, honestly.
Yeah.
As much as I was intrigued by the story and I really wanted to learn more, I felt like every time I learned something new, I was confused by something else that
It was
didn't
a
seem
chore.
to flow. Yeah, it was definitely hard to get through. And even harder, I think, the second time when I knew the story and I was still struggling to follow.
Yeah.
So that was probably one of the hardest things for me.
I think that should solidify the lower rating that we've both given it, because
Yeah.
if you have to watch something 3, 4, 5 times to really get everything that is being put into it, the director did not do a good job with the source material.
I agree.
It's totally different when, you watch The Matrix and the first time you watch it, it's like, oh, wow, I can follow this and it's pretty crazy. But then you're like, well, really, what is this? And then as you watch it more and more, you learn more and more and you see, through the different layers, and you understand the movie from like, a philosophical standpoint. But when you're looking at something from, a first time watch, if you watch it one time and you don't know that you have to pay attention while you're watching it, and you just go into it as, an average watch, I'm just going to throw on a movie, you're going to leave that documentary saying, well, I don't know what happened.
I think that's kind of how I felt after having watched it the first time,
Which I
taking
think,
that break and moving on. Like, you were asking me questions as we were going. I'm like, honestly, I don't remember.
okay,
Honestly,
so
I have no idea.
hear me out, because I talk about how we rate it before we talk about it, and then we rate it again after we talk about it. I feel like I'm giving it a 5 because of the source material, and I feel bad about what happened to this girl, because when you really think about it, and when you talk about watching this documentary, understanding what they're putting out there, being able to follow it and being impacted by it, 5 is too high.
I think I'm going to drop my score to a 5 from a 5.5, strictly because I think you can't discount the source material. I think you can't say that they didn't do a good job of portraying the big points, and that it did still keep you questioning and wanting answers to things and wondering about things, and it definitely kept your attention, at least in that respect. But yeah, so I think I'm going to land on a 5. What about you?
5 even, so you've dropped half a point.
Correct.
Me, I'm just aggravated because I'm trying to think back. Like imagine me having watched this documentary, a couple weeks ago now, and trying to tell somebody this story.
I mean, we just did it. It was so difficult.
Right, but this is you also, with some notes written down about what was going on. If I was just trying to tell somebody the story off the top of my head, couldn't do it.
No, definitely not.
Never. I would miss so many things. I don't know. I'm like a 3.5,
Ouch.
maybe a 4.
I think a 4 is fair.
I'll give it a 4 because of Suzanne's story. And this is a true story that someone lived and a tragedy that was documented and put into the documentary.
Yes.
But I do not like the way that it was
presented.
I
agree completely. And I don't know if you're going to change your rating after I give you some answers on some other stuff. So we had put together like the biggest questions that we had throughout the documentary that we wanted answered, that we felt as though were either glossed over.
Right after we watched it, right?
Yes, right after we watched it. So these were like initial questions. We had 5 of them. So the first one was, who are the fathers of Suzanne's children? And that was something that we felt like was very confusing. We didn't really understand when Megan was born. We didn't know exactly when Michael was born. It seemed like the pregnancies were talked about, but not really in order and kind of all over the place. And you really didn't know when she was pregnant, with who, by who.
How many times?
Exactly. So I had looked that up after the fact, which, I mean, I get that you can't always fit everything into a documentary, but this is something that I think could have been talked about.
In a multi-part series.
Exactly. So, unfortunately, the answer to this question is still pretty unclear. We do know, obviously, that she had the 2 pregnancies. I believe Megan's was when she was in high school, maybe. Or that could have been a different baby altogether, one that we don't even know about. So that's where, you know, it gets confusing and it's kind of unclear what happened to that first child. So I think, if I'm understanding it correctly, I believe the first baby when she was pregnant in high school, we don't know what happened. Then there was Megan, and she was apparently brought to foster care or some sort of, you know, adoption agency at some point between when she was Sharon and Tanya, I'm pretty sure.
But it's believed that Floyd is her father.
Potentially.
Speculated.
It is speculated that Franklin Floyd could be Megan's father.
So we don't have any definitive answers on anybody.
There's pretty much no definitive answers. They only said that it's possible that Michael's father is one of 2 different men that Suzanne had been dating at one point. Unclear exactly when, but it was after Megan was born.
So we don't know Michael's father. We don't know definitively Megan's father. And we don't know definitively how many children Suzanne had.
Correct. It's one of those things where I just don't know how or why they're not able to confirm it.
I mean, you got to think, when a woman has a baby, or when a baby is dropped off at an adoption agency, unless they're dropped off in, you know, a wicker basket and some blankets at the doorstep, there must be some paperwork. There must be like, okay, what's your child? What's the child's name? Blah, 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 this, that, and the other.
Yeah, but a simple DNA test to confirm, you know? I mean, I can understand maybe the 2 different men that she was dating. If they don't want to give up their DNA, sure, that's fine. Right. That's their right. But
how do we not know that Floyd is definitively Megan's father?
Well, so that's what I want to know. His DNA has to be in the system. He's on freaking death row.
You would assume so, at least, yeah.
Yeah, and she had a test done to confirm that Suzanne was her mother. So that one I'm a little confused about. And then, you know, you just kind of wonder, maybe they couldn't track down people that knew Suzanne after they had left when she was pregnant the first time.
Yeah.
I'm not really sure. So unfortunately, that's just a question that we just end up left with and we really don't have any answers to. Another question we had was, what happened to Suzanne's sisters? So we know that Franklin Floyd had abducted all 3 of them, but then he had dropped off the 2 girls and had just taken Suzanne with him, and then obviously went on this insane life with her. So I found that the 2 girls had actually been brought into some sort of adoption agency. They were adopted shortly after they had been brought wherever he brought them. So they were fine, it seems. But what I found to be the most wild, that was literally not talked about at all, not even touched on, not even whispered about in this documentary, is that Suzanne had a freaking brother.
Was he also abducted?
Yes. From what I understand, there were 4 children of the Seveguses.
All of them were abducted. Suzanne was the only one that Floyd took to keep.
Correct.
And the rest were all dropped off at adoption agencies or foster care or some type of agency that ended up taking them in and finding them placement.
Correct. So the brother's name was Philip, and apparently they originally speculated that he was also potentially killed by Floyd, like how Michael ended up
Interesting.
killed by him. Yeah. So
I wonder if Michael's dead.
he is dead. He admitted to it.
Okay, he admitted to it, but where's the body?
Well, he told them where the body was. They just didn't find it.
Okay. Well, if they're thinking that Philip was murdered by him,
Mm-hmm.
and it turns out that he's alive and well,
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's true.
who knows? Reasonable doubt.
Yes, very true. So it also said that he was likely dropped off to foster care or some sort of agency.
Mhm.
But then he like resurfaced in 2019 saying, no, these were my sisters. Like the Savakises were my parents. And they were like, okay, we'll do DNA tests. And they confirmed that he's actually Suzanne's brother.
So it's not like the girl from Europe or whatever that said that she was this
Madeline
girl.
McCann. Yeah, no. So they confirmed that it actually was him. And this apparently all happened in like 2019, 2020. And this documentary came out in 2022. Why the heck wasn't this included? I don't understand the reasoning behind removing the brother from it.
Well, I could see that maybe, he had come forward around that time. He resurfaced in 2019. Maybe he was making claims that he was her brother and that he had been abducted and put into foster care or whatever. But none of these claims were yet substantiated. And then maybe the DNA test came out after the fact to confirm it. So, during production and post-production and everything, they couldn't confirm or deny his story. So they chose not to put it in there. But, I mean, they had so many other hooks and, rug pulls and all this other stuff in the documentary that they could have said. And in such and such a year, somebody has come forward to say that they are this too, but it's still pending.
Well, yeah, they had plenty of questions they didn't answer, so why not just throw one more in? I mean,
Yeah, I mean, you think about like all of these other documentaries and movies and stuff like that end with just text on a screen, and it could say, in 2019, Philip such and such came forward, said that he was also Suzanne's brother and had been abducted at the same time, but DNA test results are still pending.
Exactly.
But it wasn't even put in there.
No, not at all.
Which
they
is
just
weird.
completely glossed over it. And I just would love to know the reason why someone said, nah, that doesn't need to be in there. So then we wanted to know more about Cheryl and her case. There were not a lot of details. How did that all come full circle? How were they able to nail Floyd for that crime? All of that. So obviously we know that there had been the picture. So I think maybe that was like the biggest thing to tie him to that.
The picture that was found under
the principal's
pickup truck.
Exactly.
After abducting Michael and the principal.
Yeah. So I did.
And I mean, we're talking, this isn't digital dissemination of, child porn or whatever. These are probably freaking Polaroids
they were. Yep.
Whatever that are put in there. So it's not like, this principal knew Floyd and then taped them under his truck to try and stick him for it. It's like, these clearly came from Floyd. Why would he be in possession of these unless he took these? He had a connection to this girl. He probably had some connection to her death. So
yeah. So the biggest thing that I think, we've talked about already is like the biggest detriment of the way this documentary was presented was the way in which they presented the timeline. And for the situation with Cheryl, I was very lost on when things took place and what exactly happened, when she was found, when she was identified, all of this. So I did a little digging on that and found that she went missing in April of 1989. So at this point, that was only a year before Suzanne was actually Tanya and when she was killed.
Yeah.
So you're like, wow. Like now that I'm hearing this and like feeling out this timeline,
and
I'm
connecting those dots.
Yeah,
it's like,
it was that
was fast.
Close together. Okay, wow. So that didn't come across for me when I was watching this. She was also only 18 years old, which looking at her photo, I was totally shocked by. I did not expect that she was that young. And
well, I mean, we look at a lot of cases from the 70s, 80s, and 90s.
Yeah.
And a lot of times, these girls from the 80s, they look like they could be, late 20s, early 30s nowadays.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, different times, different aesthetics.
Big hair.
Big hair, yeah.
That was a big one. But, so anyway, her body was actually not found until March of 1995. So, it was skeletal remains at that point. She was a Jane Doe. She was unidentified. She was not identified until 2 years later in 1997. And this is yet another question that created a question for me where I was like, okay, so if she wasn't identified until 1997, that's when Floyd was tracked down for Michael. and then they
No,
found
no, no.
these
I think,
pictures and like all of this. Like the timeline just did not make sense to me.
well, I would have assumed that, and again, I could be totally wrong because, again, I couldn't follow this documentary to save my life, but I would have assumed that, you know, they had found the pickup truck, they had the photographs, but they just couldn't connect who those photographs were of.
Yeah.
Right? And then once they started making more and more connections, Floyd was already in prison for Michael's abduction.
Mm-hmm.
And then they were like, okay, we think this Jane Doe is this person. Let's go talk to him and let's try and figure this out and see what the deal is.
But like it didn't make it clear. So Michael was abducted in September of 1994. A short time after that is when they tracked Floyd down. But then it takes 2 to 3 years to identify who this woman was. Like, I just felt like the way the documentary was presented, it made it seem like everything was happening very consecutively.
Yeah.
At least in regards to that.
In regards to whatever timeline they were working at the time, it
Yeah.
seemed like it was consecutive. But
Yeah.
I don't know, and we could be totally wrong and misconstruing what actually happened in there because, again, it was very difficult to follow. And that's
Yeah.
why I think I'm borderline 3.5.
Yeah. So then he actually was found guilty of her murder in 2002.
Mm-hmm.
So it was so much later. And again, it's just like another one of those things with the timeline. When did they find all of this out? And I think the beginning half, yes, it was a little all over the place, but I felt like it was a bit easier to follow than the second half with the timeline. I think the timeline was like basically out the freaking window in the second half of this documentary versus the first half.
So here's my hot take.
Okay.
They could have started the documentary the exact same way they did.
Mm-hmm.
Tanya Hughes and Clarence Hughes,
Yep.
Tanya's killed in an alleged motor vehicle accident, hit and run, and Clarence is really shady, blah, blah, blah. They have all that going. And then they could just drop the same hook of, these people aren't who they say they are.
Mm-hmm.
And then they could have very well started with Suzanne. Grew up in a loving home, father and mother. Father was at the war in Vietnam, mother, blah, blah, blah. She ended up meeting somebody else. And then just going through the timeline, and then it's like, boom. Her and her siblings are abducted by this guy.
Mm-hmm.
All of these other siblings are dropped off at agencies or, somehow get into foster care.
And then how her life ended
But
up
Suzanne
where
is
it
nowhere to
was.
be found.
Yes.
And
yes.
then start going to Flash 2, Sharon.
Mm-hmm.
Flash 2, Tanya. Flash 2, Suzanne, after being discovered who she really was.
I agree, yeah.
I mean, that would have been so much easier to follow, and I think it would have been just as impactful because
Yep.
you would have been able to understand what the hell was going on.
I agree. I think they were trying to almost do something like interesting and different by
Yeah.
going backwards, but I think,
It was an artistic endeavor, and it did not pay off.
yeah, they went backwards, forwards, sideways, backwards again, forwards, sideways, backwards again, and then like shoot forward like years and years down the line, and
Right.
you're like, just way too confusing.
Yeah.
So another question we had was, when was she pregnant with Megan, which kind of went back to the first question, which is just like, we really don't know,
Right.
unfortunately.
Might have been around high school age.
Yeah, that's kind of what
knows?
it seems like, but we really don't know for sure. And I think my biggest question out of every possible question I could have for this documentary stems right back to the very beginning, the hook of this whole thing, of how they started it, with this woman being found in this situation. It
In bad
might have
shape.
been
Yep.
a hit and run. It might have been a potential beating. They obviously laid the groundwork for you wondering if Floyd was the person who did this to her, and then they completely ignore it. For the rest of the documentary, there is no justice for Suzanne other than the fact that, yes, this is wonderful, she got her name back, but what about how she freaking died?
Right. You never know if she was murdered or not.
You never find that out. The only thing I've been able to find online is that they suspect that he was involved in her death. Why was there so much emphasis on getting her name back? Of course that's important. She had an insane story, but why is no one trying to find justice for her?
Mm-hmm.
That's
I mean, this
what I
guy's
don't
on death
get.
row.
Of course, but he's not on death row for her death.
Right. But you would think if you're going to do this whole documentary and you're hoping for information, you would talk to all these people that have interviewed him and talk to him.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think the FBI guys touched on the fact that he never admitted to Suzanne's murder
Yeah.
or Suzanne's death.
Yeah.
And I mean, if you're thinking about it, okay, well, if the guy's on death row,
Mm-hmm.
what does he have to lose? Like, you have all these confession killers that are
Yeah.
like, oh, I did this, I did this, I did this. And it turns
Mm-hmm.
out they never did anything. But if this guy's confessing to killing Michael and he's on death row, and then he gets charged and convicted of killing Cheryl, it's like, okay, you're going to die via the gas chamber or whatever, lethal injection, eventually anyway. Just tell the truth on this one.
Yeah.
Did you kill her? And like you said, how this whole wild story begins, they never give you closure.
No, they give you this big question of, but how did she actually die? Because none of her injuries were adding up with a hit and run. They're instantly making you ask that question within like the first 5-10 minutes of this documentary. You get through an hour and 45 minutes, you get to the end, and it was literally never touched on again.
3.5.
Yeah, I think I might drop it to a 4.5.
See what I mean?
Guys, see,
you start
this
talking
is what
about
we
it, and you
mean.
start, levying all these issues that you've had with it, and it's like, wow.
I feel like Suzanne deserved so much more than what they put together.
And that's why I feel...
I think this is a hot take. I think we have a hot take of an episode on this documentary based on at least the IMDb review.
Well, I think that knowing how tragic of a story this has been for so many people...
Yes.
And this is what they put out for the documentary.
I know.
I'd be pissed. It's like, yes, you have this tragic story here, and this is what you put out?
And this is the thing that I think about.
3.0. I'm just kidding. 3.5 I think is all right.
So I think this is the thing about doing this in podcast format, right? So when I first watched this documentary, and I'm pretty sure if Lexi's listening, she might remember our conversation about this. And I'm pretty sure I was like, oh my God, I thought it was so good. What a crazy story, blah, blah, blah. And, when you just watch something once, just essentially like you're throwing it on just to have something on, or like you're interested in this story or whatever it is. And then you're not looking at it in the same light, and you're just listening to the story and you're like, wow, that's crazy. But when you get down to it and you look at the small details and you actually watch it,
and you're going to build this production around it.
Yeah.
You're going to build this production around this true story. These are real things that happen to real people.
You just wish that
more care and time was put into it, and it's like, okay.
It's like the
if this was your
exploitation
family
of true
member,
crime stories.
Right. If this was your family member, would you feel as though you did them justice by presenting their story in this fashion?
What I would like to know is all like the people that sign off on stuff like this, like how they could say...
It's all about money.
Of course it's all about money, but how they could all sign off and say, yep, this makes sense. Yep, I'm not confused. Yep, this story is put together in the perfect order, exactly as it should be told. And I think more than anything, outside of not finding justice for Suzanne and all of that, honestly, it just keeps like sticking out in my head, is the amount of people that were interviewed for this documentary. 20 people. 20 people.
That all took time out of their day to come in and answer your questions and be videotaped and be put out for the world to see them.
For literally, though, like 5 minutes of like each person's story, I don't think that, like, they focused more on the author than they did on Cheryl Comesso.
Yeah.
Why?
I don't know.
Like, these are the things that I just genuinely wonder, the people behind the scenes, and I feel bad. Like, I kind of feel bad. I feel like we're like shitting on people right now, but I genuinely would want to know, people who work in the entertainment industry who genuinely have like experience doing this.
All you need to do is look at the type of entertainment that's put out right now. You have these things that are really great that like transcend what common everyday content is. Like you have Succession, you have all these good shows.
Yeah.
But then the majority of stuff that gets put out is garbage.
It is true. Like we spend...
Like I'm a friggin' nerd, right? Obi-Wan Kenobi, absolutely terrible. The Mandalorian, absolutely terrible. These shows that are being produced right now from a fictional standpoint, where you can imagine whatever you want to imagine, are so bad. Can you really trust somebody to take a true story and do it right?
Doesn't seem that way, and definitely not in the true crime world.
It's a flash in the pan when it happens.
Yeah, and I feel like you just realize that more, and I feel like we are realizing that more now, like the exploitation that goes into these stories and the way that people are telling them that, it feels dirty, the way they're going about it, because they know that this is an interesting story. They know that this is something that you probably are not going to see again. Yeah. This is very rare. It's a wild ride.
You're not going to watch
tragic,
it multiple times.
It's heartbreaking. but it's something that they know. They know for an absolute fact they can get views, they can get clicks, and they don't care what they have to do to get the story out there. And, you know, I really do genuinely wonder if other people agree with kind of the take that we have on this, because so many people seem to like this documentary.
I'd say
and we're
if you
over here
watched
saying
it once,
like we think it's really poorly done.
Well, it's hard to detach from the emotional reality that this is a true story and true things that happen to real people.
Yeah.
But when you look at it from a production standpoint, it is bad. It is bad. It is confusing. It jumps all over the place. It leaves out pertinent information.
Like important information to these people's stories too. That's the other thing. And I feel like you've probably touched on this a little bit already, but these people lived real lives. Why is Suzanne's brother not talked about? They're like, you're not important, but we're going to talk to this author that wrote a book about her. He's way more important than you are. Or, you know, all these, and not shitting on the author at all. He did a great job, you know, working on everything. But, you know, why is it that these people are picking other people to be considered more important for this documentary?
Of course,
than
you can't
others?
get everybody.
But that's the thing. They have 20 people.
I totally get it, and I'm just playing devil's advocate here. If you are budgeted to make a documentary, a 2-hour documentary, you can't fit 30 people in there. You can't.
Well, how
put
did you
50
see
people
this
in
story
there.
and say, yeah, this is going to be a less than 2-hour documentary? They completely sold the story short from the very beginning if this is what they signed on for.
Yes.
And
if they knew what they were covering and they were like, yes, I can do that in 2 hours, then they were lying. Yes. If they can do it well in 2 hours, they were lying.
Yeah.
Or they just had, you know, illusions of grandeur and they were like, oh yeah, I can do that. This will be the masterpiece of masterpieces. You know, so I don't want to continue harping on it over and over again. I think that
yeah, I think we should end it with a question for our listeners.
Sure. We'll end our episode with that, but I want to end with just a take on the documentary itself. And this is from somebody that I used to watch on TV when I was a young lad, when I used to have to turn the knob to change the channel. RogerEbert.com. Of course, he's not with us anymore, but they still have critics that will review movies, documentaries, media, whatever, on RogerEbert.com. And from a review by Christy Lemire from July 6th of 2022, she rated The Girl in the Picture. And the first line of the review states, quote, "At first, the story is fascinating. Soon, it becomes dizzying. Quickly, it turns sickening, and eventually, it's heartbreaking."
Yeah. Yep. I think that's absolutely perfect. Perfect way to describe it.
And I think the dizzying, whereas it does become that, it never unbecomes that.
I agree.
It follows through the whole time, and I think that's the detriment. And she ended up rating it a 2.5 out of 5.
Really?
So where
average,
you were,
then where I am. Okay.
5 out of 10. But talking about it more and being more critical, if she had talked to other people about it in a similar fashion that we're doing it, she may have dropped it a little bit lower too. But that's what she ended. And I didn't read the entire review. I was just looking. I was like, oh, Roger Ebert. Oh, wait, he's dead. Okay, this is a girl doing it on his website.
Interesting. I've never even heard of him, honestly. Sorry.
Siskel and Ebert?
No.
Ebert and Roper after
No.
Siskel died?
No.
Oh, I have been like
Was this something
a
your
movie
dad?
person.
Your dad?
Are you kidding me? My dad watched Law and Order and friggin' CSI and Blue Bloods. That's about it.
The reruns. NCIS.
Yeah, and The Phantom Gourmet.
Yes, you
I
cannot
think that was on
forget
Sundays.
The Phantom Gourmet.
But no, it's just something I've always been passionate about, and I always thought it was interesting to hear people's opinions on things after reviewing them. And
so maybe this isn't such a hot take then. So that's the question I want to end with is, do you guys think that our opinion on this documentary is a hot take, or do you agree with us? Or do you think we're being too harsh? And do you agree more with the IMDb rating, or more along the lines of the average between John and I's of, I would say it's about a 4.
Yeah, it's about a 4.
What we give it as an average.
Right. I would say if you haven't watched the documentary, you now know that it is dizzying. You're
prepared.
You're prepared, so you can go into watching it as, okay, this is going to be tough to follow. I need to really put my thinking cap on and pay attention. Or if you've watched it once, watch it a second time after listening to this and let us know if you kind of pick out the issues that we've had with it, or if we are totally off base and don't know what we're talking about.
Tell us why.
Let us know.
Yep. So I think that is about where we'll end it. And if you are listening to this episode on the day that it is released, you have another episode to listen to that has been dropped in your feed. So if you want to head over there, you can listen to a brand new case that John and I are discussing.
Yes. And if you have any other media, true crime adjacent or true crime documentaries or whatever, that you would like to hear our takes on, whether they be hot or cold takes,
Yeah.
let us know.
Okay, bye. Thank you all so much for tuning in every week. We're so happy to have you here. Make sure to leave us a 5-star review before you go and follow us on our socials.
You can follow us on Instagram at Wicked Deeds Pod and on Twitter at Wicked Deeds. Don't forget to visit our website, wickeddeedspodcast.com, to take a look at any photos from this episode and view our source material.
But most importantly, tune in next week for an all-new episode.